At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns simply stopped. No victory parade. No surrender ceremony on a battlefield. Just silence. After 4 years of the loudest sound in human history, soldiers stood up from their trenches for the first time in months. Some cried. Some didn't believe it. Why did the deadliest war the world had ever seen end with a handshake instead of a knockout? The war had already cost over 16 million lives. Entire villages in France had vanished from the map. Britain, France, Germany, and dozens of other nations were financially and physically exhausted. By late 1918, Germany's army was collapsing from the inside. Soldiers were mutinying. Supply lines were breaking down. The Kaiser had already fled to the Netherlands. So Germany asked for a ceasefire, not a surrender. A ceasefire. That distinction matters more than most people realize. The Armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France at 5 a.m. There was no formal defeat on paper. Germany's army walked home in relatively good order, flags still flying. To many German soldiers, it didn't feel like losing. It felt like a pause. Why does that distinction matter? Because a war that ends without a clear loser leaves room for someone to claim it was never really lost at all. The actual peace treaty came 7 months later, at Versailles in 1919. It forced Germany to accept blame for the entire war and pay reparations that crippled its economy for over a decade. Historian John Maynard Keynes warned at the time that the treaty's harshness would create economic devastation and, in his words, breed resentment for a generation. He was right. Hyperinflation destroyed German savings by 1923. Millions were unemployed by the early 1930s. Into that vacuum stepped a failed painter with a grudge and a following. Adolf Hitler didn't invent German resentment. He simply pointed at the armistice and the treaty that followed and gave people someone to blame. The myth that Germany's army was stabbed in the back by politicians, not defeated on the battlefield, became one of his most powerful tools. 21 years after the guns fell silent in 1918, they started again. World War II began not as a separate war, but as the unfinished business of the first one. The armistice didn't end a war. It postponed one. Somewhere in that railway carriage in Compiègne, a peace was signed that both sides could interpret however they needed to survive it. And that quiet ambiguity, more than any battle, may be the real reason the 20th century became the bloodiest in human history.